Hello. Today we're going to talk about something that is really close to my heart and comes from my own personal experience of this past year of 2020. And I call this talk Self-Care on Rails. But before we get started, I just want to share a little about who is speaking to you right now. My name is Ben Greenberg, and I'm a developer advocate at Orbit. Orbit is a company that helps you automate and to really gain insight into the community engagement of your developer community and helps you to build richer data models and understand and help you facilitate more impactful, closer and more meaningful developer communities. I live here in Israel, outside Tel Aviv, and this is pertinent to our topic today. I have children, which you'll see why that's important as we move a little bit further on into the talk. So what are we going to do together in this time? First, we're going to take a bit of a meta moment, and we're going to talk about what this talk is actually about. And then we're going to spend some time discussing the sort of obligation to do good with code. And in the midst of that, to also not forget yourself. And lastly, but certainly not least, I'm going to leave you with a couple examples of how that manifested for me in my life and in my family's life in this past year of 2020. So let's get started by talking about what we're actually talking about. In this talk, we're really less focused on code. We're going to talk about some code, don't get me wrong, but that's not our primary aim in this talk. Our actual talk's focus is actually on you, and it's on me. It's about us as Rails developers and as people. So while we will discuss code, the primary focus of our time together is actually on you. And I want to begin that conversation of me, and of us by sharing this text from the Babylonian Talmud, which is an ancient wisdom text from a couple thousand years ago, mostly compiled in what is now modern day Iraq. And in the Babylonian Talmud, it discusses how one should think about strategies for lowering one's anxiety. And I don't know about you, but certainly for me, this past year was one of a bit of anxiety. And so the Talmud suggests that to help you lower the temperature, to help you restore some semblance of calm, you should think about sharing your concerns with others. The more you share with others, the higher chance you have to help lower the anxiety that you are currently experiencing. And that is what this talk is about. It's about sharing the concerns that I had in this past year, the challenges that surfaced for me and my family in the midst of COVID, and my strategies for dealing with them. Because not only do I hope to lower my own anxiety by sharing and by creating this opportunity of learning together, but hopefully can help those if you've struggled with some sense of despair or some sense of challenge in this past year, to share and build a community together that can help each other in this time. Because this talk, as I said, and I'm going to say it again, is about you and about me and what we can do as Ruby on Rails developers to help ourselves and to share it with others. You know, we as Ruby devs, as Rails devs, our community is blessed with a lot of good initiatives to help both our particularistic language community and our framework community, to help the larger, taking one step further up, the larger developer community, but also to help society writ large. You know, there's so many wonderful initiatives out there. Things like Ruby for Good, Rails Girls, Ruby Together, and of course Ruby Central, which puts together RubyConf and RailsConf, and also hosts Ruby Gems, which none of this would be possible. All of our code, all of the gems without Ruby Gems. There's a lot we do in the world to help others, whether they're up and coming new developers into the industry or people and nonprofits, organizations that need some technical support, some creative solutions to the problems they're facing. And in fact, you might be able to argue that there is a special ethical obligation to do that kind of good work. Sandy Metz, in her talk from 2019, Lucky You, she quotes this political scientist from the University of Chicago who argues that the burden to help people in society most heavily falls upon those who are most amply rewarded. And software developers in almost every society are some of the most highly rewarded and highly compensated members of the community. So perhaps there is actually an ethical obligation to do that kind of good work. There is a relatively new initiative out there called the Hippocratic License. The Hippocratic License, it aims to be a supplemental and additional open source license in addition to the popular ones like the MIT and others, which is most concerned not with attribution of code and who can share the code and how they must attribute who originally wrote the code, which is a lot of what open source licensing is most concerned with. But its aim, its objective is to be mostly concerned with the ways in which code is used. You put out code in the open source world, you contribute some code out there. How is it used in the world at large? Is it used to move the needle of society for the better? Is it move it more good? Or is it used for the opposite? And the open source license, this license, the Hippocratic license, says in its introduction that it had a pivotal realization that the software we create has a real and lasting impact on the world in which we live. And if it has a real impact on the world in which we live, then we have a responsibility to do good and to make sure our code is used to do good in the world. That's all to say about the larger society, whether it's the smaller society of Ruby devs and Rails devs, or it's the larger developer community, or even taking a step back, it's the society and the world writ large. We have to, perhaps. We have an obligation, perhaps, to do good in that context. But in the midst of all of that, in the midst of doing good for others, we ought not forget ourselves. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? You know, speaking for myself, and maybe this can resonate, we can often forget ourselves as something that matters, as someone who matters. You know, the idea of oneself and having self-interest can be a bit of a loaded concept. The Midwest Academy Manual, which is a seminal text of community organizing, I think actually puts it in a bit of perspective. When you say that you have self-interest, when you say that there are things that matter to you, it doesn't have to be a negative connotation. It doesn't have to evoke negative emotional reactions. Self-interest can ultimately be asserting yourself amongst other selves. That in that cacophony of voices in the world, of people, in that chorus of voices of interest, competing interests, your interest is one of those interests. And it matters. You matter as a person, and what is important to you, what bothers you, what drives you, those things, they matter. And this is really important, and perhaps even more important in this past year of 2020 and also continuing into 2021. The New York Times on February 14th, 2021, published an article talking about the sweeping mental health crisis across the European continent. And this is not only in Europe, this is something faced around the world, that while we're both grappling with at the same time physical health crises that the virus poses to all of us, at the same time we have a competing mental health crisis that is exacerbated by the very things that are helping fight the physical health crises. So things like in Italy and the Netherlands, youth psychiatry wards have filled to record capacity. In France, the mental health of children had gotten so bad that mental health professionals urged authorities to consider reopening schools in the midst of the lockdowns to fight loneliness. And in Britain, some therapists had counseled patients to break lockdown guidelines to cope, because in that struggle, in that tension between physical health and mental health was really suffering. And not only on the macro level, but even on the micro level, one's own family and one's own context. In May of this year, there was an article published in the Dev blog post where this person talks about what's it like to suddenly go with your partner, living a life where you leave the home, you come back to the home, you work somewhere else, you live somewhere, you live there, but you work somewhere else. You may have all these other kinds of points on the map in which you spend your day, to having that condensed to just your home. And they write that sharing the same workspace with their partner has put a strain on their relationship. And they realize that they have terrible office manners. You realize things about the people closest to you when you have to live with them in the same confined space 24 hours a day. So not only were there macro issues, the mental health of societies throughout Europe and in the Americas and in Asia and Africa, but in addition to that, there were the micro issues of your own self and your own family struggling with issues that were wrought upon us by the very things that were helping us deal with the physical concerns of the actual virus. If this sounds familiar to you, you're not alone. This certainly sounds, the picture I painted sounds familiar to me. And it's something that we grappled with as a family, that I grappled with as a person. And I want to share with you a couple examples from my own life of how I use the skill set that I have and the skill set that many of us have as Ruby developers, as Ruby on Rails developers, to build solutions to help ease this time where I focus a bit inwards in order to address the inner concerns of my own family, and by doing so made the life that we live a little bit more manageable in this really unprecedented time. I want to share with you two examples. One is what to do around birthday parties for children and how we addressed it in our own family. And then also sort of what happens when now we're living in the midst of a pandemic, health authorities impose all sorts of new bureaucracy upon us for justifiable reasons, but it's still more bureaucracy, more forms, how we can automate that process. I want to start with what may be an obvious point. Parenting isn't easy. And parenting during a pandemic is fill in the blank. It is immensely challenging. Now, parenting during a pandemic is immensely challenging when you are locked down. You know, we were confined to within maybe a kilometer of our home for most of the time. Really couldn't leave the home for weeks at a time. And children, as this may feel familiar to many of you, went from being in school all the time to being in remote classes on a myriad Zooms. We didn't have a great internet connection at home. And so a lot of freezing Zooms, and I was trying to work and my wife was trying to work, and it was a really challenging time. Now, on top of that is birthdays. And my kids take their birthdays really seriously. They're both still pretty little, and they love their birthdays. They talk about it for months. They plan their activities. They get really creative. You know, they really enjoy the act of writing invitations for their friends to come to their birthday parties. It's really a thing for them. Now, explaining to them that because of this pandemic, your birthday party is going to look very different than this year than it did in years past. Well, they can understand it on some level, but they're still small. They couldn't really grasp at the deepest level and really come to terms with the fact of why this had to be taken away from them. And as a parent who loves them and cares about them deeply, this impacted me as well. And I wanted to help them. And so my wife and I sat down and said, well, what can we do for their birthday party in 2020? Well, we just came up with a whole list of X's. We couldn't do soccer parties, couldn't do a movie theater, no bowling in arcades, certainly no games in our apartment. And it just kept on going on and on, X after X after X. But thankfully, Rails came to the rescue. And I sat at my computer in my office, my home office, and I said to myself, okay, Rails has to solve this for me. So I typed Rails new birthday party. I didn't know what this would look like yet. I didn't know what it would be, but I knew that somehow I could build something that would help. And in this Rails app, I leveraged an open source technology called Webrtc. You may be familiar with it. Webrtc enables real-time video communication amongst peers, so you can build video apps with Webrtc. It's an open web standard, actually. You can actually access its functions within your Google, let's say Google Chrome Inspect tool or in Firefox. It's amazing. It's available. It's open source. Webrtc.org is where you can find all the documentation and sample code to get you started, and you can start building a video application with Webrtc. So I said, that's awesome. So I'm going to build and try and create a remote version of a birthday party that watches a movie. So, you know, you would have those birthday parties, and they're, for my kids, pretty low key, but still better than not having a birthday party, where you invite all your friends and you watch something on TV together and you chat before and then you chat after, and you maybe have the birthday cake, and you can still, like, you're still chatting a little bit during the movie itself. So let's do that, but not all together in the physical space. And I'm going to create an app that can create that experience, but online. And I'm going to use Webrtc to do it. And Webrtc at the beginning feels pretty simple. You know, it's JavaScript. And so you can access these things from the person's web browser. You get their media devices with their webcam, their audio input, audio output, and you can get those data points and those objects, and you can really just put them into the DOM with inside a div, and you can, there it gets a lot of front end work and designing it right, a lot of CSS styling, but you get the data points, you get the media objects, and you can just then inject them into the DOM, and you build a video experience. Well, that sounds pretty great. So I started building it, and I realized very quickly, like a lot of things in tech, that what begins as something as deceptively simple can become endlessly complicated. Arnold Palmer, the great golf expert, said the same thing about golf. What's deceptively simple is endlessly complicated. It satisfies the soul and it frustrates the intellect. Well, I think we can say the same thing about coding too. And Webrtc, as an open web standard, is phenomenal. It's amazing. But I don't have the time to become an expert in Webrtc. And the needs I had for it got more complex than my ability to do it. And I was getting really frustrated. Thankfully, there is help. There's APIs out there that can help you abstract away a lot of that complexity. Now, there's several of them. Two of the big players in the space are Twilio and Vonage, which what they do is they create API endpoints for you, and they do all the complex work with Webrtc, and they help you create the experience by all you need to do is access the API endpoints, get back the data, and then inject it into your DOM. So in the Vonage example, for example, there is a Ruby SDK that you can use on the server side where you can instantiate the video session and the tokens can have a moderator access privilege or only a participant access privilege. You can generate all kinds of permissions on the token, and then you pass those things to the client side, let's say whether it's in your Webpack assets or your asset pipeline, by passing them in with script tag and creating them as JavaScript variables. On the Twilio side, there isn't a Ruby SDK, server SDK, but there is a very versatile client-side SDK, and you'd require that SDK on your asset pipeline or your Webpack assets, and then you could use that in your DOM as well. So Vonage and Twilio offer you those options. There are others as well, but they offer you the ability to abstract a lot of that complexity around Webrtc, provide you with API endpoints, and let you get up and running. But unfortunately, as we know, in this world today, we can't escape JavaScript. So yes, there's a Ruby SDK on the Vonage side, so you can do some of it in Ruby, but you're going to have to write some JavaScript, alas. Now, I don't mean for you to read these things on the slide, so if you can't read it, it's okay, but it's just there by way of demonstration that how you might do this. So you would create a publisher instance from, let's say this is the Vonage code examples, create a publisher instance from the Vonage client-side SDK, tell it what kind of DOM interactions you want it to have, and then you would set up a lot of different event listeners, listening for different DOM interactions. So when a session is created, when a session is subscribed to, when a session is destroyed, you dynamically adjusting the DOM accordingly, either removing video elements, adding video elements, changing their sizing. It's all happening kind of live and in the moment by all these different event handlers that you have to create on the client side. And once you get that up and running, you end up with something like this. And this is what the birthday party app looked like for my son. So it was a bit a stretch for me on the front end side. I'm mostly a back end developer, but I worked hard on this, and I'm thankful for some of my colleagues and friends who really lent a hand to help with the front end work as well, because that front end is so challenging, especially if you're a back end developer. There's so much work that happens there. It's amazing. And so you would come onto a intro page. It's in Hebrew because we live in Israel, and the intro page says, "Welcome to my party. What is your name and what's the password for the party?" My son sent the password to his friends in advance. They come into the party, and the top window shows you what it looks like when they come in. It becomes a video chat, and as each person joins, the page automatically adjusts the video windows so they become boxes. And on the left hand side is that semi-transparent text chat, so they can text chat as well. And on the bottom part is what it looks like when they're screen sharing. So my son, who would be given the moderator privileges, his token would be for a moderator. He would be able to then switch it to watch party. So going from chat mode to watch party mode, and then let's say he would watch a Netflix movie or a Netflix show with his friends, and that semi-transparent chat box would still be there, and they could talk to each other the way you might talk if you're in a living room, all watching something together. And then when the movie is done, he could go back to the video chat experience and continue video chatting with his friends. So it becomes like a simulated experience of what it's like to have a birthday party watching a movie together when you're all hanging out in the same living room or in the same entertainment room or what have you. And he loved this, and it helped address a really challenging issue for us and gave him a birthday party experience that was enjoyable and let him feel like he could still celebrate his birthday despite the pandemic, despite the lockdowns, despite all the challenges that we were facing. Now, I might have said this already, but it keeps coming back to my mind. Parenting is not easy. And parenting, we could say that so many times, right? Parenting isn't easy. It's challenging. And in addition to helping to either scale down or scale up, in this case, scale down a child's expectations around a time of pandemic, we also have to deal with all the increased parental responsibilities that are manifest upon us in this time. In particular, increasing health responsibilities and health reporting. So the local Ministry of Health here where we live in the state of Israel, when school was in session, in between lockdowns, parents had to submit digitally a health declaration every day to the school. So you can imagine the scenario. In addition to all the other things you're doing to get your children ready for school in the beginning of the day, and no matter how much time you give yourself in the morning, it's never enough time. But doing all those things you need to do, getting the school lunch ready, making sure their backpacks are packed, making sure their homework is in their backpacks, making sure that they brush their teeth and that they comb their hair and their shoes are on the right feet and everything else you have to do as a parent to get them ready for school and out the door. You also had to go to your computer, log on to the website, navigate to the health form, fill out the form, submit it, and make sure it's submitted without any errors. So if you were like me, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, you may have forgotten this form every once in a while. And you forget the form, you get that call from the school administrator and you dread that call. It's embarrassing. Hello, Mr. Greenberg. Yes. I think you forgot to fill out the health form. You really need to do that right now. And you don't want to be that kind of parent. It's just a lot. And when everything is up in the air, when you're dealing with the midst of a pandemic, even one small new thing like a form can cause it, or in this case, can cause you to just crash. You're trying to balance everything. It's a lot. So when I looked at this and I saw a repetitive task, something that had to be the same and do it every single day, this is what the form looked like. Well, to me, and maybe to you as well as a developer, this cried out for automation. So when faced with a repetitive task, I said, let's make a gem for that. So I published a gem called School Declare, and it lets you send your daily health forms. It automates the process for Israeli schools using the platform that they use. And from what I've heard, other parents in the school system have also been using it. I've made it a daily cron job action, a daily cron job with GitHub Actions. It's really helped our family a lot. But as parents, as the adults who have to do more increased bureaucracy as a result of the pandemic. And the form itself, the application is relatively not too complex. It uses web scraping. So it goes using, headless browsing, goes to that forms page, logs me in, clicks through, navigates to the form, fills out the form for each child. So it goes through the list of children. In this case, we have 2. So it goes list of children, fills out the form for each one, and then validates that the form was filled out, that there were no errors present on the page. And if there were no errors present on the page, it sent me at the end an SMS message letting me know that the form was sent that day. So as we were leaving the house every morning to send the kids off to school, I could look at my phone. I would get that buzz, look at my phone and say, look at that. It was sent successfully. And I didn't receive any more phone calls from the school administrator saying, hello, Mr. Greenberg, you forgot to fill out that form again. The dreaded phone call. It didn't have to happen again. But this is all to say, though, that this talk, as I said in the beginning, it wasn't really about code. Yes, there was some code here. We talked about WebRTC. We talked about building WebRTC apps on Rails using different APIs. We talked about publishing a gem and web scraping to help automate health forms. But that's not what we really were talking about. What we're really talking about in this time together was about me. The challenges that I, as a father and as a partner and as a human being, faced in 2020 and still throughout 2021 currently, in the midst of a global health crisis, in the midst of lockdowns, in the midst of so much, closing down of society, and what that did for our family and for me as a person. But this talk was also about you as a developer, because I learned something as a dev, and you probably learned this as well, that when you're facing a problem, let's say you have a bug in your code and you're trying to deal with it, and you've Googled it, you've come across 1,000 Stack Overflow posts, and nothing addresses your problem. And finally, after banging your head against the wall numerous times, you solve that problem. Well, if you just solve that problem and walk away, you're not going to help others, because what I've learned as a developer is if I have that problem, there are others who have that problem too. So I've come into the habit of when I address a problem that I haven't seen solved before, I try and write about it as a blog post or publish it, the code on GitHub at the very least, or I raise a PR in the project where the problem was, or raise a GitHub issue or what have you. Because if I have the problem, then chances are probably someone else has the problem too. And so while this talk was about me, it was also about you, because maybe you've also had these problems, because as together, this talk was really also primarily about us, me and you together making us, and how we can solve these things together. Because the more we do to help ourselves, and the more we share that, the more we can lower our own personal anxiety, but we can also help lower the collective anxiety. In this past year, I needed to give myself, and I invite you to also give yourself permission, to make your life just a little bit easier, to make your life, a little less stressful, to make your life a little calmer. It's been a tough year. And as Ruby on Rails developers, we have a unique skill set that we can contribute with, that we can build solutions. And those solutions, they can start at home. They can start in your own home. And when you build those for your own home and you share them, you help make the world just a little bit better for others. Because as we said before, your self-interest is not a bad term. It is recognizing that you are a unique self with amongst other selves, and that your interest is part of the cacophony of competing interests out there, and that you matter, your family matters, the challenges they face matter. Educators in this past year and currently still have been using their skill set to really be innovative in the field of education. And I, as a parent, have benefited from that with amazing educators. And medical staff, there's not enough we can say about medical staff and medical professionals, how much they have done to help so many people and to move us forward in solving this crisis. Scientists and what they've done in helping solve this crisis, and the incredible speed of publishing and releasing and the research that came out to help push forward the vaccines. And everyone in their different skill sets have done so much to help others, to help themselves. We too can do so much as devs, and that can start at home. To not forget yourself, because your skill set, just like educators, just like others, it can help others, but it can also help you. And by helping you and by helping yourself, you can, if you share that, can help others you love and you care about, and the larger community and the larger society, all at once. It's an amazing thing. I want to thank you for this time. This talk, as I said, was a bit personal for me. I shared some of the challenges we faced as a family in this past year and the solutions we built for it. It came out of a place of really deep concern, and I hope it was helpful for you as well. I would love to hear what you think. You can find me on bengreenberg.dev, or you can find me on Twitter at Rabbi Greenberg, and I'll be around throughout RailsConf in our Discord server. And I really look forward to talking with you about the ways in which you have addressed the challenges this past year and your creative solutions. I'm sure there's so many of them. I want to leave you with a few resources. One is you can find that gem to the health form declaration gem on Ruby Gems. The birthday video app that I built, I open sourced it. You can find it on bit.ly/RailsBirthday. Feel free to clone it and make it yours and to use it for your own needs, for you or for other people that you are in your family or that are close to you or your colleagues. And if you do use it, I would love to hear about the ways in which you use it. And I did reference the Twilio Video Api and the Vonage Video API as APIs that help abstract and deal with a lot of the complexities of Webrtc. They can be found at twilio.com and vonage.com respectively, and Webrtc is at webrtc.org. It has been such a pleasure, and I look forward to hearing about all the ways in which you have dealt with the challenge this past year as a Ruby on Rails developer. Enjoy the rest of RailsConf.